The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Martha Hayes stepped down into a cloud of dust that tasted like copper and dirt. She was 300 miles from everything she'd ever known, standing in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a worn leather bag and hope that was already starting to fade. The town spread out before her, if you could even call it town. A dozen rough wooden buildings lined a single dirt road, and every single one of them looked like a strong wind might knock it over. What Martha didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that just 2 miles away on a ridge beyond town, a man was cleaning his rifle. His name was Raven, and his hands were still steady even though he'd used that same rifle to end 3 lives just that morning. The bodies were already buried behind the barn where nobody would think to look. And in less than an hour, Martha would be knocking on his door, asking for a man who was already dead and buried in one of those shallow graves. Raven wasn't planning on telling her that. Not yet anyway. Martha was 32 years old and had the kind of face people forgot the moment she walked away. Plain brown hair always pinned back tight. Simple features that never drew a second glance. Gray dress that had seen better days, but was clean and mended carefully. She learned a long time ago that being forgettable was safer than being noticed, especially for a woman alone in the world. She'd been working in a boarding house kitchen in Boston for 14 years, ever since she was 18 years old. 14 years of the same thing every single day. Wake up before dawn. Cook breakfast for 20 boarders. Clean the kitchen. Cook lunch. Clean again. Cook dinner. Clean again. Collapse in a bed in the tiny attic room that was so small she could touch both walls with her arms spread out. And then do it all again the next day. The pay was barely enough to cover her room and food. She'd managed to save a little bit, hiding coins in an old sock under her mattress, but it was never enough to change anything. Boston was expensive, and opportunities for unmarried women with no family and no connections were few and far between. She watched other girls come and go from the boarding house, most of them ending up married to men they didn't love or working jobs that slowly crushed their spirits. Martha had started to think that was just how life was. You survived it, you didn't enjoy it. Then 6 weeks ago, she'd seen the advertisement in the newspaper. Someone had left it on the kitchen table, and Martha had read it while waiting for bread to rise. Cook wanted for Frontier Ranch. Room and board provided. Good wages for the right woman. Must be unmarried and willing to relocate to Montana Territory. Apply to Samuel Brennan, Redemption Flats. Montana Territory. Martha had tried to imagine it. Wide open spaces. Clean air. Mountains in the distance. A place where the past didn't matter because everyone was starting fresh. She'd written a letter that same night, sitting up in her attic room with a candle burning low. She kept it simple, explained her experience, mentioned that she was 32, unmarried, with no family ties. Said she was a hard worker who didn't complain and didn't cause trouble. Samuel Brennan's reply came 3 weeks later. The letter was formal but kind. He was a widower, he wrote, running a cattle ranch on his own. He needed someone to cook for himself and his ranch hands during the busy seasons. The work would be hard, he admitted, but honest. He promised fair wages, a private room, and respectful treatment. He asked if she could start in a month. Martha had given her notice at the boarding house the next day. She'd used her savings to buy a ticket on the railroad heading west, then another ticket on the stagecoach that would take her the final stretch to Redemption Flats. She packed everything she owned into one bag. It wasn't much. 3 dresses, some underclothes, a hairbrush, a Bible her mother had given her before she died, and a small knife for cooking. That was it. That was her entire life fitting into one bag. The journey had taken 2 weeks. Long days on trains that smelled like coal smoke and sweat. Then longer days on a stagecoach that rattled her bones and made her teeth ache. She'd traveled with strangers who didn't talk much. Men heading west to find gold or land. A few women traveling to meet husbands they'd never seen except in photographs. Everyone looked tired and hopeful at the same time, like they were running from something and running towards something else all at once. Now here she was, standing in Redemption Flats with dust settling on her dress and doubt settling in her stomach. The stagecoach driver had already tossed her bag down and was climbing back up to his seat. "Brennan Ranch?" She called up to him. He pointed north without looking at her. 2 miles that way. Follow the road till it forks, then take the right path. Can't miss it." The stage pulled away, leaving her standing alone. A few people moved along the wooden sidewalks, but nobody paid her any attention. Martha picked up her bag and started walking. The sun was high and hot, hotter than she'd expected. Back in Boston, it was probably cool and cloudy right now. Here, the heat pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. Sweat started to run down her back under her dress. Her feet hurt in her good shoes, the only pair she owned that weren't completely worn through. She walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. The town disappeared behind her, and there was nothing but flat land dotted with scrubby bushes and the occasional tree. Mountains rose in the distance, blue and hazy. The sky stretched out forever, bigger than any sky she'd ever seen. It made her feel small and exposed, like there was nowhere to hide out here. Then she saw it, the ranch. A white house that had probably been pretty once, but now looked gray with dust and age. A big red barn stood behind it, and she could see corrals with fence posts standing at angles. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady. Someone was home. Martha felt her heart beat faster. This was it. Her new life was about to start. She walked up to the porch on legs that suddenly felt weak. The house was quiet. No sounds of ranch hands working, no cattle lowing, nothing but the wind moving through the grass. She climbed the 3 steps to the porch and stood in front of the door. Her hand shook a little as she raised it to knock. 3 firm raps on the wood, loud enough to be heard inside. Nothing happened. She waited, counting her heartbeats. 30 seconds passed. A minute. She raised her hand to knock again, when suddenly the door swung open. A man stood there, and Martha's first thought was that he didn't look like a widowed rancher. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and arms that looked strong enough to break a man in half. Dark hair hung past his collar, and he hadn't shaved in days. But it was his eyes that made her take a step back. Gray eyes, cold as winter, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not friendly, not unfriendly, just calculating, like he was deciding something about her. "Can I help you?" His voice was deep and rough, not unkind exactly, but not warm either. Martha swallowed hard and tried to find her voice. "I'm looking for Samuel Brennan. I'm Martha Hayes. He hired me to cook for him. I've come all the way from Boston." The man stared at her for a long moment. Something flickered in those gray eyes, something that might have been surprise or might have been amusement. Then he said 2 words that made Martha's stomach drop straight to her feet. "He's dead." Martha felt the world tilt. "What? No, that can't be right. He wrote to me just a month ago. He said to come. He said he needed a cook. He said—" The man crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe. "Samuel Brennan died 2 weeks ago. I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing. But what happened? Was he sick?" Martha's mind was racing. 2 weeks ago. He'd been alive when she left Boston. He'd been alive when she was on the train. He died while she was traveling across the country to work for him. Heart gave out, the man said flatly. Happens to men his age. One day they're fine, the next day they're not. Found him in the barn. Martha stood there, her bag feeling suddenly heavy in her hand. This couldn't be happening. She'd left everything. Spent all her money. Traveled 300 miles. And for what? For a job that didn't exist anymore with a man who was dead. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. The man straightened up. "Raven. I own the ranch next to this one. Been keeping an eye on the place since Brennan passed. Making sure nobody tries to steal anything." Martha's mind was working frantically, trying to figure out what to do now. She had maybe $3 left in her pocket. Not enough to get back to Boston, even if she wanted to go back. Which she didn't. There was nothing for her there. But there was nothing for her here either, apparently. "I don't know what to do," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded. Raven looked at her for another long moment with those cold gray eyes. Then he said something that should have sounded like salvation, but somehow didn't feel like it at all. Well, now, maybe we can work something out. I could use a cook myself. Same arrangement Brennan offered you. Maybe even better. Room and board, fair wages. What do you say? Martha looked at him. Really looked at him. Something felt wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Maybe it was just that he was a stranger and she was desperate. Maybe it was the way he was looking at her, like she was a problem he was trying to solve. Or maybe it was something else, something deeper that she couldn't name. But what choice did she have? She had no money, no way to get back to Boston, no other options standing in front of her. She took a breath and said the words that would change everything. All right, I'll stay. Raven smiled then, and Martha felt a chill run down her spine despite the heat of the afternoon sun. Good decision, he said. Come on inside. Let me show you around. He stepped back to let her pass, and Martha walked through the door into Samuel Brennan's house, not knowing that she was walking straight into a trap set by a killer, not knowing that the man standing behind her had murdered the rancher she'd come to work for, not knowing that in the barn behind the house, there were 3 fresh graves that nobody was supposed to find. She just walked inside, carrying her bag and her hope, while Raven closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded, if you listened closely, exactly like a trap snapping shut. The inside of the house was cool and dark after the bright afternoon sun. Martha stood just inside the doorway, waiting for her eyes to adjust. The main room was simple but well kept. A wooden table with 4 chairs sat near a stone fireplace. A sofa that had seen better days faced the fire. Shelves lined one wall, holding books and a few dishes. Everything was neat, almost too neat, like someone had cleaned up in a hurry and put things where they thought they should go rather than where they actually belonged. Raven moved past her and gestured around the room. Kitchen's through there, he said, pointing to a doorway on the left. 2 bedrooms down that hall. You can have the smaller one. Brennan used the big one, but I've been sleeping out at my own place mostly. Just come by here during the day to check on things. He walked to the kitchen doorway and looked back at her. You want some water? You look half dead from that walk. Martha realized her throat was bone dry. Yes, please. She set her bag down by the door and followed him into the kitchen. It was bigger than she'd expected, with a wood stove, a good-sized work table, and shelves stocked with supplies. A pump stood over a deep sink, and Raven worked the handle a few times before clear water gushed out. He filled a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank it down fast, then felt embarrassed by her desperation. Raven watched her with those gray eyes, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying her, taking her measure like a man, sizing up a horse he might buy. Thank you, she said quietly, handing the cup back. He refilled it without asking and gave it back to her. Drink slow this time. You'll make yourself sick. Martha sipped the second cup while Raven leaned against the counter with his arms crossed. So, he said, you really came all the way from Boston to cook for an old rancher you'd never met? There was something in his voice, maybe amusement, maybe something else. I did, Martha said. I've been cooking in a boarding house for 14 years. When I saw Mr. Brennan's advertisement, it seemed like a chance for something different. Something different, Raven repeated, like he was tasting the words. Well, you got that all right. This is about as different from Boston as you can get. He pushed off from the counter and walked to the window, looking out at the yard. Brennan was a good man. Quiet. Kept to himself mostly. Been running this place alone since his wife died 5 years back. He mentioned in his letter that he was a widower, Martha said. She wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand what had happened, but something held her back. Maybe it was the way Raven's shoulders were tense, or the way he kept his hand near his belt where she could now see he wore a gun. A big revolver in a worn leather holster. Heart just gave out on him, Raven continued, still looking out the window. Found him myself, actually. Came over to borrow some tools, and there he was, collapsed in the barn. Nothing anybody could have done. He turned back to face her, and his expression was unreadable. His ranch hands left right after. Didn't want to stick around with no boss to pay them. Can't say I blame them, but it left me in a spot trying to watch 2 ranches at once. Something about that didn't sit right with Martha. All of them left? How many were there? Raven's eyes narrowed slightly, just for a second, so fast she almost missed it. 3. They all rode out together the day after the funeral, headed south looking for other work. He moved toward her, and Martha had to force herself not to step back. Now, about my offer. I meant what I said. I need a cook. My place is just over the ridge, about a mile from here. But this house is set up better for having someone live in. You could stay here, cook for me, and I'd pay you the same wage Brennan promised. Maybe more if the food's good. Martha's mind was racing. This wasn't what she'd planned. She was supposed to work for Samuel Brennan, a widower who'd sounded kind in his letters. Instead, she'd be working for this stranger, this Raven, who made her skin prickle with unease. But what choice did she have? Where would you be? She asked. I mean, if I'm staying here and you're at your ranch. I'd come by for meals, Raven said. Breakfast, dinner, sometimes lunch if I'm working this side of the property. Rest of the time, you'd have the place to yourself. You could keep it up, tend the garden, maybe look after the chickens Brennan kept. Easy work. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. And you'd be safe here. A woman alone on the frontier needs protection. I make sure nobody bothered you. The way he said it made Martha's stomach turn. Like she should be grateful. Like he was doing her a favor. But he was right about one thing. She was alone, 300 miles from anything familiar, with almost no money and nowhere else to go. If she said no, what then? Walk back to town and sleep in the street. All right, she heard herself say. I'll do it. Same terms Mr. Brennan offered. Room and board, and wages of $15 a month. Raven's smile widened. $20 a month, he said. Like I said, maybe better than Brennan offered. You start tomorrow morning. Breakfast at dawn. He moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back at her. Oh, and Martha, don't go wandering around too much. Rattlesnakes out here are mean, and there's other dangers too. Best to stick close to the house unless I'm with you. Understand, it wasn't really a question. It was an order dressed up as friendly advice. Martha nodded, her throat tight. I understand. Raven tipped his hat to her, a gesture that should have seemed polite but felt mocking. Good. I'll be back for dinner. Cook whatever you can find in the pantry. I'm not particular. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a solid thunk. Martha stood in the kitchen, listening to his footsteps cross the porch and fade away. She waited until she couldn't hear them anymore, then walked quickly to the window and watched him mount a horse tied to the fence post. He rode away without looking back, heading toward the ridge in the distance. Only then did Martha let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter and tried to calm down. This was fine. She was fine. She had a job and a place to stay. Raven was just a rancher, probably rough around the edges like most men out here. She was being paranoid because everything was new and strange. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She walked through the house, checking each room. The bigger bedroom looked lived in recently. The bed was made, but rumpled, like someone had been sleeping on top of the covers. Men's clothes hung in the wardrobe, but they were too small for Raven. These must have been Brennan's clothes. A pair of boots sat by the bed, caked with dried mud. On the small table beside the bed, there was a photograph in a frame. A man and woman, both middle-aged, standing stiff and formal the way people did for photographs. Samuel Brennan and his wife, Martha guessed. She picked up the photograph and studied the man's face. He looked kind, tired but kind. And now he was dead, buried somewhere, and she was living in his house. It felt wrong, like she was trespassing. She set the photograph down carefully and moved to the smaller bedroom that would be hers. It was plain but clean. A narrow bed with a quilt that looked handmade. A small dresser with a cracked mirror above it. A window that looked out over the yard toward the barn. Martha unpacked her bag, hanging her 2 other dresses in the small wardrobe and putting her few belongings in the dresser drawer. When everything was put away, she stood at the window and looked out. The barn door was open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Beyond it, she could see a chicken coop, and what looked like a vegetable garden that needed weeding. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, but Martha's eyes kept going back to the barn. Raven had said he found Brennan collapsed in there. She wondered which spot, wondered if someone had cleaned up afterward or if there were still signs of what had happened. She shook her head, trying to clear away the morbid thoughts. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she needed to cook dinner for Raven, prove she was worth keeping around, and figure out how to survive in this strange new place. She went back to the kitchen and started going through the pantry. There were dried beans, flour, cornmeal, salt pork, coffee, and a few canned goods. In the root cellar, she found potatoes, onions, and carrots. Enough to make a decent meal. She got to work, letting the familiar motions of cooking calm her nerves. Peel the potatoes, chop the onions, get the stove fire going. She'd done this thousands of times before. This was something she knew how to do. As the sun started to sink toward the horizon, Martha had dinner ready. Fried potatoes and onions, salt pork cooked until it was crispy, and biscuits that had turned out better than she'd expected with the unfamiliar stove. She set the table for two, then stood at the window, watching for Raven to return. The sky was turning orange and pink, and long shadows stretched across the yard. It was beautiful in a harsh, lonely way. She saw him coming when he was still far off, a dark shape on horseback against the sunset. Her stomach tightened with nervousness. She didn't know this man, didn't know what he expected or how he'd react if something wasn't to his liking. She'd worked for difficult men before, bosses who yelled and threw things when the food wasn't right. But she'd never been alone with one, miles from anywhere, with no one to hear her scream if things went wrong. Raven tied his horse up and came inside without knocking. He'd washed up somewhere, his face clean and his hair wet, and pushed back. He looked at the table, at the food waiting there, and nodded once. "Smells good," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. Martha served him, then sat down across from him with a smaller portion for herself. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Raven shoveled food into his mouth like he hadn't eaten in days, barely chewing before swallowing. Martha picked at her plate, her appetite gone. "You cook good," Raven said finally, sopping up the last of his potatoes with a piece of biscuit. "Better than Brennan's hands did, that's for sure." He leaned back in his chair and studied her across the table. "You got any family back in Boston? Husband? Sweetheart?" "No," Martha said quietly. "No family. My parents are dead. I was never married." Raven's eyebrows went up. "Never married? Woman your age? That's unusual." Martha felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment and anger. "I was engaged once. It didn't work out. And I've been working, supporting myself. That didn't leave much time for courting. So nobody knows you're here," Raven said slowly, like he was thinking through something. "Nobody expecting letters or visits or anything like that." The way he asked it made Martha's skin crawl, but she kept her voice steady. "I told the landlady at the boarding house where I was going. She knows I'm in Montana Territory, working for Mr. Brennan." It was a lie, but Raven didn't need to know that. The landlady hadn't cared where Martha was going as long as she paid the week's rent she owed. Raven nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Good. It's good to have someone who knows where you are. Frontier can be dangerous for a woman alone." He stood up, and Martha flinched slightly before she could stop herself. Raven noticed. She saw something flicker in his expression, satisfaction, maybe, or amusement. "I'll be back tomorrow morning for breakfast. Dawn." He walked to the door, then turned back. "Oh, and Martha, tonight, you might want to push your dresser against your bedroom door, just to be safe. Never know what might wander by out here. Animals and such." He left before she could respond, his footsteps fading into the darkness outside. Martha sat at the table, her heart pounding. Animals and such. Was that a warning or a threat? She cleaned up the dishes with shaking hands, scrubbing each plate longer than necessary, trying to burn off the anxiety buzzing through her body. When she finally went to her room, she did exactly what Raven had suggested. She pushed the dresser against the door, wedging it tight. Then she checked the window latch 3 times to make sure it was secure. She lay down on the bed fully clothed, staring up at the dark ceiling, and tried to convince herself that everything would be fine. But sleep didn't come easy. Every sound made her jump. The wind against the house, a coyote howling somewhere far off, the creak of old wood settling. And sometime deep in the night, when exhaustion finally pulled her under, Martha dreamed of cold gray eyes watching her from the shadows, and a door closing with a sound like a trap snapping shut. When she woke in the morning, gray light just starting to show through the window, the first thing she saw were the gun belts hanging on the wall across from her bed. 3 of them, leather worn smooth with use. She sat up slowly, her heart starting to race. She hadn't noticed them last night in the dark, but now, in the early morning light, she could see them clearly. 3 gun belts, 3 holsters, and carved into each one different initials. JMTRDK. Not one of them belonged to Raven. Martha stared at those gun belts for a full minute, her mind racing. 3 belts. Raven had said 3 ranch hands left after Brennan died. But why would they leave their gun belts behind? Out here on the frontier, a gun wasn't just protection, it was survival. No ranch hand would ride off without his weapon, unless he couldn't take it with him, unless he was dead. She got up quickly and moved the dresser away from the door as quietly as she could. Her hands were shaking. She needed to think clearly, needed to figure out what was happening here. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe those belts had been left behind years ago. Maybe they belonged to previous workers who'd moved on. But the leather wasn't old and cracked. It was worn but well-maintained, like it had been used recently. Martha dressed and went to the kitchen to start breakfast. Her mind kept circling back to those initials while her hands went through the automatic motions of cooking. Slice the salt pork. Start the coffee. Mix the biscuit dough. She was frying eggs when she heard the horse approaching. Raven was right on time. He came in with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Morning. Something smells good. He sat down at the table like he owned the place, which maybe he did now. Maybe that was the point. Martha served him breakfast and poured his coffee, then sat down with her own plate. She needed to act normal. Couldn't let him see that anything was wrong. Sleep well? Raven asked, cutting into his eggs. Yes, thank you, Martha lied. The bed is comfortable. Raven nodded, chewing slowly. Good. I was thinking today you could clean up around here. Place needs a woman's touch. Brennan let things get dusty. He took a long drink of coffee. I'll be working on the north pasture most of the day. Won't be back till dinner. After he left, Martha stood at the window and watched him ride away. She waited until he was just a speck in the distance. Then she moved. She had maybe 8 hours before he'd return. 8 hours to figure out what was really going on here. She started in Brennan's bedroom, searching carefully through his things. In a drawer of the bedside table, she found letters. Recent letters, still in their envelopes. They were addressed to Samuel Brennan, postmarked from just 3 weeks ago. Letters he never opened because he was already dead. But Raven had said Brennan died 2 weeks ago. These letters arrived after that, which meant someone had been collecting the mail, bringing it to the house, and just leaving it here unopened. Why would Raven do that unless he was trying to make it look like Brennan had just died recently? Martha's stomach twisted. Nothing about this was right. She put the letters back exactly as she'd found them and went outside. The morning sun was already hot, and the yard was quiet except for the chickens scratching in their pen. Martha walked toward the barn, her heart pounding. She didn't want to go in there, but she had to know. Had to see if there was anything that would explain what had happened to Brennan and his ranch hands. The barn was dim and smelled of hay and leather and something else, something metallic that made her think of blood. She let her eyes adjust to the darkness, then walked slowly down the center aisle between the empty stalls. Everything looked normal at first. Tools hanging on the walls, saddles on the racks, bags of feed stacked in a corner. But then she saw it. On the floor near the back wall, there were dark stains in the dirt. Old blood, scrubbed at but not completely cleaned away. A lot of blood. More than a man with a heart problem would leave behind. Martha backed out of the barn quickly, fighting down the panic rising in her throat. She walked around behind the building, looking for anything else unusual. That's when she saw the disturbed earth. For patches of ground where the dirt had been turned recently, the soil a different color than everything around it. For rectangular patches, each about 6 feet long. Graves. Fresh graves, barely concealed. She should have run right then. Should have started walking toward town and never looked back. But her legs wouldn't move. She stood there staring at those graves, knowing with absolute certainty that Samuel Brennan was buried in one of them. And the other 3? The ranch hands. JM, TR, and DK. The men whose gun belts hung on her bedroom wall like trophies. Raven hadn't found Brennan dead. Raven had killed him. Had killed all of them. And now Martha was living in a dead man's house, cooking for his murderer, trapped miles from help with no money and no way to escape. The sun beat down on her head, and she could taste copper in her mouth. This couldn't be happening, but it was. She was standing behind a barn looking at 4 shallow graves, and the man who'd put those bodies there would be back in a few hours expecting his dinner. Martha walked back to the house on legs that barely held her weight. She went to her room and sat on the bed, staring at those gun belts on the wall. Raven had left them there on purpose, she realized. He wanted her to see them, wanted her to know what he'd done. It was a message, a warning. This is what happens to people who cross me. This is what I'm capable of. Stay useful and stay quiet, or you'll end up in the ground too. She had to get away, had to escape somehow. But how? She had no horse, no money for the stagecoach, and it was 2 miles to town through open country where Raven could see her from far away. Even if she made it to town, who would believe her? She had no proof, just suspicions and some disturbed dirt behind a barn. Raven was a landowner, probably respected in these parts. She was just a cook from Boston, a stranger with a wild story. No, she couldn't run. Not yet. She had to be smart about this. Had to wait for the right moment, the right opportunity. Until then, she had to pretend everything was fine. Had to keep cooking his meals and acting grateful for the job. Had to survive long enough to find a way out. Martha lay back on the bed and closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She could do this. She'd survived plenty of hard things before. She could survive Raven too. She just had to stay calm, stay smart, and wait for her chance. The days blurred together into a routine that felt like walking on broken glass. Martha cooked breakfast at dawn. Raven would arrive, eat in silence, or make small talk that felt like interrogation. Then he'd leave for hours, and Martha would clean or tend the garden or feed the chickens, always aware that he could come back early, always watching the horizon for his horse. Then dinner, more uncomfortable conversation, and finally he'd leave and she'd barricade herself in her room until morning. A week passed. Then 2. Raven paid her at the end of the second week, counting out $40 in cash and laying it on the table between them. "You've earned it," he said, watching her face. "Good food, kept the place clean. I'm satisfied with your work." Martha took the money with trembling fingers and tucked it into her dress pocket. $40 wasn't enough to get far, but it was something. It was hope. But Raven's behavior was changing, getting bolder. He started staying later after dinner, sitting by the fireplace with a bottle of whiskey, drinking and talking. At first his stories were harmless. Growing up in Texas, learning to handle cattle, the hard winters and harder men he'd known. But then the stories got darker. He told her about a ranch he'd worked on where the owner got careless and had an accident with a horse. "Broke his neck," Raven said, swirling whiskey in his glass. "Real shame. But accidents happen out here all the time." The way he said it made Martha's blood run cold. That wasn't an accident. It was murder, and Raven was bragging about it. He was testing her, seeing how she'd react. She kept her face blank and just nodded. "That is a shame," she said quietly. Raven smiled at her over his glass. "You're smart, Martha. I like that about you. You know when to talk and when to keep quiet." Another night, he told her about some trouble on a neighboring ranch. Had some workers who got ideas above their station, he said. Thought they could take what wasn't theirs. Had to teach them a lesson. He leaned forward, His gray eyes locked on hers. "You know what happens to people who steal from me, Martha?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "They disappear," Raven said softly. "Just vanish like they never existed at all." Martha understood the message. She was useful now, but if she tried to leave, if she tried to tell anyone what she suspected, she'd disappear too. Just like Brennan. Just like Jam and TR and DK. She was living in a nightmare, cooking meals for a man who could kill her without a second thought. But then something changed. One afternoon, when Raven thought she was in the garden, Martha was actually in the house and heard him talking to his horse outside. "Deputies coming through next week," he muttered. "Gotta make sure everything looks right. Gotta keep that cook girl quiet and cooperative." A deputy. Law enforcement would be passing through the area. That was her chance. If she could just get a message to him somehow, tell him what she'd found, maybe she'd survive this. That night at dinner, Martha asked carefully, "Do you ever go into town?" Raven looked up from his plate. "Sometimes." "What?" She tried to sound casual. "I was thinking I might need some supplies soon. For cooking. Flour and such." Raven studied her for a long moment. "I'll pick up whatever you need. You don't need to go into town. Nothing there for you anyway." He was keeping her isolated, making sure she couldn't talk to anyone. Martha felt the walls closing in. She had maybe a week before the deputy came through, and she had to figure out how to signal him without Raven knowing. But how? She couldn't leave a note because Raven might find it. She couldn't run into town because he'd see her. She was trapped in this house with a killer, and time was running out. The next few days, Martha started preparing. She hid a knife from the kitchen under her mattress. Small enough to conceal, sharp enough to defend herself if it came to that. She packed a small bundle of food and hid it in the chicken coop where Raven never went. She studied the land around the ranch, memorizing the paths and hiding spots. If she had to run, she needed to know where to go. Raven noticed her confidence growing, and he didn't like it. One evening, he cornered her in the kitchen after dinner. He didn't touch her, but stood close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You thinking about something, Martha?" he asked quietly. "You got a look in your eyes like you're planning." Her heart hammered in her chest. "No, sir. Just thinking about tomorrow's meals." Raven reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and it took everything in Martha not to flinch away. "That's good," he said, "because you and me, we got a good thing here. Be ashamed to ruin it." That night, Martha barely slept. She lay in bed with a knife under her pillow, listening to every sound outside. The house creaked in the wind. Something scratched at the window, probably a branch. Or maybe it was Raven, testing to see if she'd locked it. She didn't know anymore. Fear was making her paranoid, seeing threats everywhere. The next morning, everything came to a head. Martha was making breakfast when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses. She looked out the window and saw Raven riding up with another man. An older rancher with a weathered face and kind eyes. A neighbor, maybe someone from town. Her heart leaped. This was it. This was her chance. Raven and the man came inside, and Raven introduced him. "Martha, this is Frank Wilson. Owns the spread on the other side of mine. Frank, this is my cook, Martha Hayes." Frank tipped his hat to her. "Pleasure, ma'am." Didn't know Raven had hired help. There was something in the way Frank said it, a question hidden underneath the polite words. Like he was surprised Raven would have a woman working for him. Martha's mind raced. She could say something right now. Could tell Frank she was scared, that something wasn't right, that there were grays behind the barn. But Raven was standing right there, watching her with those cold gray eyes. If she spoke up and Frank didn't believe her, or if Frank left her alone with Raven afterward, she was dead. She had to be smart about this. "Yes, sir," she said to Frank, her voice steady. "I've been here a few weeks now." Raven has been a fair employer. She saw Raven's shoulders relax slightly. Good. Let him think she was cooperating. Frank stayed for coffee and talked with Raven about cattle prices and weather. Normal rancher talk. But his eyes kept drifting to Martha, and she could tell he sensed something was off. When he finally left, he shook Raven's hand and then turned to Martha. "You take care now, ma'am. If you ever need anything, My place is just 10 miles south." After Frank left, Raven turned to Martha with a smile that made her stomach turn. "You did real good just then. Showed me I can trust you." He moved closer. "But I found something interesting this morning, Martha. Found a little bundle of food hidden in the chicken coop. Now, why would you need a bundle of food hidden away?" Martha's blood turned to ice. He'd found her escape supplies. Raven pulled out his revolver and laid it on the table between them. "So you were planning to run after all? That's disappointing, Martha. Real disappointing." Martha's mind went blank with fear, but her body moved on instinct. She was standing next to the stove where a pot of water had been heating for dishes. Without thinking, she grabbed the handle and threw the boiling water straight at Raven's face. He screamed and stumbled backward, hands flying to his eyes. The gun clattered to the floor. Martha ran. She flew out the door and across the yard, her skirts tangling around her legs. Behind her, she could hear Raven roaring with rage and pain. "You're dead. You hear me? Dead." She ran toward the barn, not because she had a plan, but because her legs carried her there. She could hear him behind her, boots pounding on the hard dirt. She made it inside the barn and looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, something to defend herself with. A pitchfork leaned against the wall. She grabbed it with shaking hands just as Raven appeared in the doorway, his face red and blistered, his eyes full of murder. "Nowhere to run now," he growled. "Should have just stayed useful, Martha. Should have kept your mouth shut and your head down." He came at her, and Martha swung the pitchfork. She missed, and Raven grabbed it, yanking it from her hands like she was a child. He threw it aside and backhanded her across the face. Martha hit the ground hard, tasting blood. Raven stood over her, and all pretense of civility was gone. This was who he really was. A killer. Cold and brutal and without mercy. "You want to know what happened to Brennan?" Raven snarled. "I shot him in the back while he was feeding his horse. Didn't even see it coming. Then his ranch hands came running, and I shot them too. Took all of 10 minutes to clear this place out. Been living in both ranches ever since, selling off Brennan's cattle as my own. Nobody questioned it. Nobody cared." He pulled out a knife from his boot. "I was going to let you live. Going to keep you around as long as you were useful. But you had to go and get smart on me." He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back. Martha felt the knife press against her throat. This was it. This was how she died. On the floor of a barn, miles from anywhere, killed by a man whose name nobody would remember. Then she heard it. The sound of a horse approaching fast. Multiple horses. Raven heard it too. He froze, the knife still at Martha's throat, and looked toward the barn door. "Stay quiet," he hissed. "Not a sound, or I'll cut your throat right here." But Martha was done being quiet, done being scared. She opened her mouth and screamed as loud as she could. "Help! He's killing me! Help!" Raven cursed and clamped his hand over her mouth, but it was too late. The horses were right outside now, and she heard men's voices. That came from the barn. Frank Wilson. The neighbor had come back. Raven dragged Martha to her feet, the knife now pressed to her side. "Walk," he ordered. "Out there. Nice and slow." They stepped out into the sunlight, and Martha saw Frank Wilson and 2 other men, all armed. Frank's face went hard when he saw the knife. "Let her go, Raven." Raven laughed, a wild sound with no humor in it. "Why would I do that? This is my property. My cook." "None of your business. Wilson, your cook." Frank said. "That's funny, because I rode by here 3 weeks ago and saw Brennan alive and well. Then I come by today, and you've got his place, his things, and a terrified woman. Something doesn't add up." One of the other men spoke up. "That's Deputy Marshal Tom Reed. I've been tracking reports of missing ranchers through this territory. You match the description of a man wanted in Texas for murder and claim jumping." Raven's grip tightened on Martha. "You got no proof of nothing." Martha found her voice. "The graves. Behind the barn. 4 of them. Brennan and his 3 ranch hands. And there's gun belts in the bedroom with their initials on them." Raven's knife pressed harder, and Martha felt it break skin. "Shut up," he hissed. But the damage was done. The deputy's gun was out now. "Let her go, Raven. It's over." Raven's eyes darted between the three men, calculating odds he couldn't win. Then he smiled, that same cold smile Martha had seen too many times. "You want her? Take her." He shoved Martha forward hard, and she stumbled toward the men. But as she fell, she saw Raven's hand move to his boot, reaching for something. A small gun, a derringer hidden there. Time slowed down. Martha hit the ground and rolled. Raven brought the derringer up, aiming at the deputy. But Martha's hand closed around a rock, and she threw it with all her strength. It hit Raven's wrist just as he fired. The shot went wild. The deputy fired back. Once, twice. Raven stumbled backward, red blooming across his chest. He looked down at the blood, then up at Martha with something like surprise in his eyes. Then he fell, first to his knees, then onto his face in the dirt. He didn't move again. Frank Wilson helped Martha to her feet while the deputy checked Raven's body. "He's dead," the marshal said flatly. Martha stood there shaking, unable to process that it was over. Really over. Frank guided her to the porch and made her sit down. "Just breathe, ma'am. You're safe now." The next hours passed in a blur. The deputy and his men found the graves behind the barn, exactly where Martha said they'd be. They found the gun belts in the bedroom. They found forged documents in Raven's saddlebag, transferring Brennan's property to himself. Everything Martha had suspected was true, and worse. The deputy told her Raven was wanted in 3 territories for murder and theft. He'd been working his way north, killing small ranchers and taking their land, then moving on before anyone connected the dots. "You're lucky to be alive," the deputy said. Most people who crossed Raven ended up in unmarked graves. Martha didn't feel lucky. She felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. But she was alive, and that was something. The town buried Raven in an unmarked grave far from decent folk. They buried Samuel Brennan and his 3 ranch hands properly, with words said over them and crosses to mark their resting places. Martha attended the funeral and stood there with her head bowed, thinking about the man she'd never met who'd offered her a chance at a new life. He'd been killed for his kindness, for having something another man wanted. The legal side took weeks to sort out. Brennan had no living relatives, and his will left everything to his wife who died years before. The town council met and debated what to do with the property. Finally, Frank Wilson stood up at the meeting and spoke. That woman survived 3 weeks living with a killer. She kept her head, found evidence, and helped bring him to justice. Samuel would have wanted his ranch to go to someone with that kind of courage. The council agreed. They offered Martha the deed to Brennan's ranch, free and clear. At first, she wanted to refuse. The place held too many bad memories, too much fear. But then she rode out there one morning and really looked at it. The white house in the sunlight, the barn that needed repairs but was sturdy, the land stretching out, full of possibility. This could be hers, not because a man gave it to her, but because she'd earned it, because she'd survived. She accepted the deed and hired 2 ranch hands that Frank recommended. Good men, honest workers who taught her about cattle and horses and how to run a working ranch. The first few months were hard. She jumped at shadows and slept with a rifle beside her bed. But slowly, the fear faded. The house stopped feeling like a trap and started feeling like a home. 6 months after Raven's death, Martha stood on her porch at sunset watching her cattle graze in the distance. She was wearing pants now instead of dresses, practical clothing for ranch work. Her hands were calloused and her face was tanned. She looked different, felt different. The timid cook from Boston was gone, replaced by someone stronger. Frank Wilson rode up and tipped his hat. "Evening, Martha. Just checking if you need anything." She smiled. "I'm good, Frank, but thank you." He nodded and rode off, and Martha went back to watching the sunset. She traveled 300 miles to cook for a stranger on the frontier. Instead, she'd faced down a killer and claimed a life she never knew she wanted. The frontier was harsh and unforgiving, but it was honest. It showed you who you really were when everything else was stripped away. Martha had learned she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Strong enough to survive. Strong enough to fight back. Strong enough to build something that was truly hers. She'd come west looking for a fresh start, and she'd found it, though not at all the way she'd expected. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky orange and red, Martha felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. She was home.